are at the very beginning of, well, Romanticism in my mind is the beginning of the modern era, because it's the first time that painters start to paint as much for themselves as for the general public. And they also begin, in many cases, to rebel against the established order. And artists have been doing it ever since, to some degree. But what was going on, I need to provide a little tiny bit of context here. What was going on in this period, England was, was isolated for a long period because of the wars on the continent. Most of the English couldn't travel to the continent. So English art for over a generation took its own course, and the English tended to concentrate on the landscape. But there's a reason why they concentrated on the landscape. The landscape was changing really fast. England was the leader in the Industrial Revolution. And even before it really got going, the English began changing their agricultural practices. And they, in the enclosures, which happened in the late 1700s, they drove the traditional people off the land. They closed the common lands, and they devoted a huge amount either to money crops for the wealthy owners of the land, or to sheep, because England was becoming a textile exporter in a major way. So the landscape all of a sudden was changing radically. And this affected people's attitude to the landscape, because a lot of people, especially someone like Constable, were incredibly attached to the traditional landscape. As well, there were rebellions. There were rebellions first by the people during the enclosures, and then later, during Constable's time, there were massive rebellions, which I'll talk about in detail later. You've probably heard of the Luddites. They were the weavers who represented a huge portion of the English population, who all of a sudden were having their livelihood taken away by the industrialization of the loom. But we'll get to that later. First, in terms of Constable, he's a young man who came from a very comfortable, fairly wealthy rural family. His father was a miller. And he had a big mill for grain. And he also had boats. This is one of his boats. Oh, it may not be his boats, but it's the boats that he had made to carry the grain down the canals to the port. And at the nearest port, he actually had his own ship, small ship, to take grain to London. So this was a very affluent family, and Constable had a wonderful, carefree youth, which he never forgot. And his entire output focuses not just on this traditional landscape, but on the area where he was raised, Dedham Vale in Sussex. Almost all his work is focused on that area. He was a real stick in the mud. He was a real John Bull. He never left England. And in later years, he said, "I'd rather be a poor man in England than a rich man on foreign soil." This was his father's vegetable garden. Wow. So you can see this was a family with a lot of property. And he was extremely close to his family. Unfortunately, his family wanted him to work in the business. And for quite a while he did. Finally, at the age of 23, he convinced his father to let him become a painter, which is something he'd always wanted to do. And it was a long struggle convincing his father to let him do this. And he attended the Royal Academy, Um, and actually, after he finished his studies at the Royal Academy in 1802, he refused a position as a drawing master at a military academy. He didn't want to be tied down. But in 1803, began exhibiting at the academy. He would live. He lived in London, but then in the summers he would mostly go back to Sussex and paint his own region. But in 1806, he tried to do what other painters like Turner did. He toured the Lake District, sketching and painting watercolors. And he said he didn't like it. He didn't like being an empty rural space. He liked this kind of countryside that he was used to, with farms and buildings. He said himself, the scenes that made him a painter: the sound of water escaping from mill dams, willows, old rotten planks, slimy posts, and brickwork. I love such things. So,
sounds like you, Anthony.
Well, a little like me. I don't think I'm as much of a stick in the mud, but
in terms of the things you're drawn to.
Yeah, no, I'm drawn to very ordinary stuff. It's true. And he's one of the first. It's important to understand what he's doing here. You know, Turner was the one who's older than him, and somewhat older than him, but really well established at the time, because Turner was already a member of the Royal Academy at 14. It wasn't until 52 when Constable was accepted in the Royal Academy. But Turner had made landscape an acceptable form. But his landscapes were still referred to major historical events or big storms or dramatic events. Constable takes it just as it is and tries to give it to us with his own affection in it. He had a childhood sweetheart also. Well, he had a childhood friend who became at a certain point his sweetheart, who lived right there in the same area in Sussex. And for 8 years, he tried to convince her family and his family that they should get married. Her family thought she'd be marrying below her station, but she was obviously sort of soulmate, and she stuck with him. And eventually, when his parents died, and he received a large commission from one of his father's friends, one of his first sales, this is the commission. He had the money for them to actually get married. And her family gave way after a 8-year siege. He did this painting, and he got this commission because he discovered there were 2 ways he could make money: portraiture, which he hated, he found it very boring, but also country homes. And he did a number of country homes as a way of bringing in, making some money. Right before his marriage, he worked on this large, for him, fairly large painting. It was over 40 inches high. And he painted this almost entirely on site, which was, now painters had done sketches on site, but no one had actually brought a painting almost to completion on site. So this is kind of a breakthrough. We know for a fact that this boy on the horse was added later. But the scene here is very close to his home. And what's going on here is they're detaching. These barges were pulled up the canals by draft horses. But here they've disconnected the draft horse, and the man on the barge is using a pole because he's pushing it under a bridge. And obviously the draft horse can't drag it when it's going under a bridge. So all of his paintings treat very ordinary moments in the rural life that he knew as a child. This actually gained him a fair amount of attention at the Royal Academy when it was shown. But Um, before that, he married his sweetheart, Maria Becknell. And they were apparently very, very close. They ended up having 7 children. And they went for their honeymoon. They went to, oh wait, there's something funny. Okay, I see what I did. Okay, they went to Dorset, and this is actually the beach on the way to Weymouth. Weymouth is on the far left. This is a beach that I'm quite familiar with, because this is where my family lived when I was a child.
Of course, it's beautiful.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it's a very beautiful part of the British coast. It gets more dramatic elsewhere, but it's also a lovely painting.
Oh, beautiful. Just stunning.
And you can see that he's probably very happy because he's finally married. And this is one he did later, probably in the studio, but at the same view, which is quite interesting, a stormy view of which is not an uncommon thing in England.
Almost no color there at all, just about.
So this was another, he started doing what he called his 6-footers. And this is called the White Horse. I'm just making sure I've, ooh, sorry. By the way, before he went to Weymouth, I should add that he had a friend. He was the friends with the Bishop of Salisbury. And the first few nights of their honeymoon, they actually spent at the bishop's, the bishop's vicarage. We'll see more of him later. Anyway, this painting caused him to be elected an associate at the Academy, which wasn't a full membership, but it was a step up. And it was described, one critic said of it, a more exact look of nature than any picture we have ever seen by an Englishman. And it is pretty stunning in its sense of place and temperature and just the real physicality of the place. Here we have the draft horse on the barge and the man is pushing it because there's obviously nowhere for it to tow the barge. But it's very well observed and quite an interesting painting. He was also, as you can see, very interested and very good with clouds. And he actually, during his life, did any number of cloud studies, little cloud studies. And he dated them all. And he also studied, it was a new science. This was the time when the science of nature, of weather, of geology was all emerging. This was an age where everyone's minds were filled with science. And he said art should be science. And he saw no contradiction between it being emotional and scientific at the same time. This is another cloud study, which is also quite beautiful and very interesting. These are very small studies, obviously, because he's trying to actually capture what he sees. Now, this is a study, this was a preliminary study for a painting. And this is what he would do. He'd go out in nature, he'd do enormous numbers of preliminary studies, and then he'd work them up into a large studio painting. His 6-footers were done in the studio in London, actually. He was going to his home county in the summer. Here, if you look carefully, there's a cart with a driver and a horse. And he obviously captured this as it happened to spark his memory when he was doing the large painting. Here's the large painting. It's known as the hay wain, which is a kind of hay cart. And this painting had Géricault, remember Géricault from our previous presentation about the Romantic painters, the young painter who died of TB at like age 29 or something. I'm forgetting right now. But he was in London and he saw this painting. He was blown away by it. And he went back to France and he told Delacroix about it. The painting actually was a sensation in London, but it didn't sell to the English. The English were not yet ready to accept this kind of very literal landscape without a historical link to it. It was eventually, interestingly enough, bought by an Anglo-French dealer who would show it in Paris. And Delacroix made a very interesting remark. He said, what Constable says about green in his meadows can be said about every color. So Delacroix was seeing something very original in the way Constable handles, especially his greens. And he thought this treatment could be transferred to all the colors of the palette. And he went back after seeing it, because he saw it before it was shown in Paris. He went back and he changed the background of his, remember the massacre at Chios, which he painted? He went back and altered the background of that painting after seeing this painting. But Constable was passionate about trees. A friend said that he embraced them emotionally as one would embrace a child.
I thought that was a photograph.
It's an elm tree. Beautifully observed. Not easy to do that. Not easy to do that kind of observation of the bark. This one is, to me, prefigures impressionism. It's a stunning little painting.
When you say little, what sizes are
I'm not sure, but I would imagine maybe 6 or 7 by 10 or 12 at the most. He did these really quick little studies. Now, this is, I mentioned his friend, the Bishop of Salisbury, Fisher. This is him and his wife. Fisher actually commissioned this painting. And he paid a really decent amount of money for it, which helped Constable a lot. Fisher was actually to buy 3 of Constable's paintings. During his whole life, Constable only sold 20 paintings in England. But to me, it's not by any means his best landscape. But it shows you what he could do with architecture.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Beautiful.
Apparently, he struggled like crazy over the architecture. But this is where he also stayed on his honeymoon, the first days of his honeymoon. I can't really imagine staying with a bishop on my honeymoon, but Fisher was Constable was incredibly conservative and traditional, and this was one of his best friends and advisors. This is also The Leaping Horse, a very famous one of his paintings, though it actually never sold in his lifetime. But you notice this is a finished large painting, but you notice he's getting looser even in his finished paintings, because he actually liked his little studies, which no one was interested in. And he wanted some of that spontaneity. So you can see that he is a bridge to later French painting and even to the Impressionists. This is one which is a memory of his own childhood. The boy who's, shepherding the sheep has stopped to take a drink out of the pond. The dog's waiting for him. In the distance, they're harvesting the field.
It's a crazy perspective. That was like such an extreme perspective.
Yeah, it's kind of wide angle, actually, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's almost like it was like Gulliver's Travels or something like big guy, little people.
You get the impression he was a happy man.
Yeah.
Well, he
That's right.
was in a very happy childhood. But this is the Haywayne, which I showed you earlier, in 1824, shows in Paris to rave reviews, and they actually give it a gold medal.
Mm.
And the French artists are bowled away by it. And this same year, the bishop commissions that painting of Salisbury Cathedral. So he's doing very well, but his wife is diagnosed with TB
Mm.
after 8 years of marriage. I believe it's 8, yeah. So what he does at this point is he moves to Brighton, which he hates, so that she can experience the sea air. But she dies around the time of this little painting,
Ugh.
and he's left with 7 children
Oh
to
my
raise
God.
by himself, and he dresses in black for the rest of his life.
Ugh.
And one wonders if this painting is a reflection on what just happened. I don't know.
How old was he when she passed?
Well, let's see.
30s, 20s, 30s, 40s.
No, he didn't marry her till he was in his 40s, so he would have been in his early late 40s, early 50s. This is painted at the time of her death, and it has, again, it's Dedham Vale, but it has a kind of melancholy
Mhm.
to it, profound melancholy, beautiful painting. But after her death, his work gets much darker and more troubled, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the detail of the white bark and the leaves are just like crispy. Nice.
Yeah, yeah. That's Dedham Vale. But this was painted after her death too. Now, he wasn't someone to usually paint castles. He wasn't that interested in historical sites, but he remarked to a friend, I think he did it because he remarked to a friend, this is a painting that reflects the ruin that I am now.
Mhm.
Henley Castle, it's interesting. It seems like this, that's what I was going to show you. That's the original study, which is really very powerful and disturbing. And then he domesticated it, probably for popular consumption there. Around this, well, a little bit later, he paints Salisbury Cathedral again. This is the statue, which is really quite a stunning study. And this is the finished painting. Now, there's quite a story behind this painting. I'm trying to figure out if they're rid of that extra, but I don't seem to be able to. Oh, I know. It was probably my cell phone, wasn't it? How did that happen? Sorry. This painting is, the stormy sky probably partly reflects his state of mind, and the very dark mood to the whole painting. But according to what we know of his conversations with the bishop, it may also have reflected something that was happening in England, which was the government had passed what was called the Catholic Emancipation Law.
Oh, did he lock up?
He froze.
I think he's locked up.
Yeah, he froze up. Hi, Anthony.
Can you hear us, Anthony? You're frozen.
I think he left and maybe coming back.
We had, it's more like a rainbow. The colors faded, but this rainbow was put in after the Bishop of Salisbury, his friend, died. And the rainbow touches the house
Mm.
where he and his wife stayed on their honeymoon. It's actually inaccurate for someone who believed in science and always paying attention to realism. The rainbow's in the wrong. You wouldn't see a rainbow with the light coming from the side like this. The light has to be generally behind you to see a rainbow. So
Right.
it's artistic license here. But it's a powerful painting, very melancholy. I can't get the image to change for some reason. Oh boy. Oh, let's see if that,
No, there you go.
no.
Are you on Acrobat or Chrome?
I'm on Acrobat. Well, this should be Acrobat actually. Let's see.
There you go.
Ah, okay, okay.
Ah.
This is a watercolor a year before he dies. He dies of a heart attack actually.
Oh, Jesus, depressing.
Well, it was a hard time in those days.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful evocation of Stonehenge at a time before it was mobbed with tourists. The rainbows had more color in them actually, and that's faded too. But it's still a lovely. And you wonder. I mean, he's old now, and he's meditating on time, and he does mention that this is a monument so distant in time we know nothing about it. He's probably thinking about, well, what happens after you die? You know, I don't know, but that certainly occurs to me. This is quite closer to where I was raised. I hung out there one night.
Mm.
Okay, so another Englishman who was born about 8 years after Constable, whose father was first a teacher of drawing, then a watercolorist who used his watercolors to make engravings that he sold, and then became a laceman. But at this particular moment in time, and they were in Nottingham. He was born in Nottingham, and they lived in Nottingham. At this particular moment in time in Nottingham, there was a movement. The Luddites, weavers who were rebelling against the modernization, industrialization of the looms, which was destroying their livelihood throughout a vast area of England. Hundreds of thousands of people lived by the loom, and they were being displaced. And so they met secretly at night in the moors, and they practiced a kind of guerrilla warfare against the new mills, the new looms, attacking them, breaking them, in a couple of instances assassinating the industrialists who owned them. England had half its army in England trying to put down this uprising for a decade.
Wow.
At the same time, the other half of the army was fighting Napoleon in Spain, Portugal and Spain. So it was a major movement. There was never a king. He was a mythic figure. But the Romantic poets were very close in thought to the Romantic painters, and had a lot of influence on many of them, were totally on the side of the Luddites. Let me find the quote from just a second, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, it's over here. Okay. Lord Byron, referring to the Luddites and to the condition of the working class in England at the time, in Parliament, because he was a lord, I have been in some of the most oppressed provinces of Turkey, but never under the most despotic infidel government did I behold such squalid wickedness as I've seen since my return in the heart of a Christian country. And there was, in 1812, there was a frame-breaking act which actually made frame-breaking a capital punishment, the breaking of the looms. Byron was opposed to it, and he actually said, "Down with all kings but King Lud." And his friend Shelley was to write, because the Romantic appear and become a really powerful movement at the very moment that industrialization takes over. And they're very concerned about the social consequences of this. And Shelley wrote, "Power like a desolating pestilence pollutes whate'er it touches, and obedience, vain of all genius, virtue, freedom, truth, makes slaves of men, and of the human frame, a mechanized automaton." As you know, Shelley's wife, after Shelley dies very young, his wife will write the what's it called? It's called Frankenstein's Monster, Dr. Frankenstein's Monster. And here they are at work, the Luddites. They weren't really, by the way, they weren't against machinery. They worked on machines themselves. They were against the process which drove them out of business and didn't give them any share of the new technology. Because, of course, the owners of the new looms wanted to make as much money as possible, and they could use cheap, unskilled labor. What they produced was inferior, actually, in quality to the handmade items before, but that didn't matter. So Bonington's father, in order to become a lace maker, smuggles 2 looms out of England and sets up in Calais. And Bonington continues drawing and painting in France, first in Calais, then they moved to Paris. And in Paris, he copied at the Louvre for a couple of years. And actually, before Delacroix actually knew him, because they became friends, he noticed him copying in the Louvre because Bonington was the only one copying in watercolor. Watercolor was something that only the British did. The French were not familiar with it at the time. Then in 1820, he attended the École des Beaux-Arts under Antoine Jean Gros. If you remember, we saw him in the earlier presentation, a classicist, not a romantic, although he had tendencies that way. And Gross finally says, "You don't belong with me." So at which point, Bonington sets off with a friend, another painter, down the Seine and travels down the Seine to Nantes, then Rouen, then Le Havre, Calais, Dunkirk. This is done in this is the painting based on his trip of bridge makers in Rouen. And actually what they're doing here is driving a pile. It's quite an accomplished painting for a young man. The thing about Bonington was how quickly he absorbed any style. This is a watercolor. And this is another one in Rouen. in which you can see the early influence of Turner's early paintings. It's a beautiful painting. When he gets back to Paris, he starts working for the first time in oil. It's in 1823. This is one of his first oils, a Normandy landscape. And really quite accomplished. This was done in the forest of Fontainebleau. But what's interesting about it is it's of no particular subject. It's just nature, which is something that he would have picked up from the English artists. Because he's English originally, though he becomes a complete Frenchman in the process of living there. He, by the way, kind of like Constable, is a very amiable and happy person, in very good relationship with his family. Quite different from someone like Turner. This is the largest oil painting he would do, and I think is a masterpiece. This is a fish market. The fishermen have come in with their fish, and people are buying them right off the boat. The sails are up, obviously, to cast shadow to keep the fish from getting too warm. This painting was shown at the Academy in 1824, the same time the Constable's painting, the Haywain, was shown there. Both paintings received gold medals.
Do those Academy or gold medals still go on, or that's sort of the past?
You know, I'm not sure if they're still giving gold medals. I don't know.
Sort of prize
The
it.
Academy, for a while, the Academy was the main place where artists could show their work. There weren't professional galleries.
Right.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, just curious if any of that stuff still exists anymore, you know?
I don't know. But this to me is a stunning work.
Look at that little bit of white and red up at the house. I don't know if that's a figure or laundry or what up there.
Oh yeah, laundry.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And how it shows, you know, all of the bits of white and red in the.
yeah. Well, there's wonderful atmospheric perspective in this.
That's oil as well.
Just painting he would ever do because, well, I'll explain that later. He's a very important figure, though. He's a transitional figure between the English school and the European school. And his acting as an ambassador to some degree, being a very sociable young man. So he got to know, he went back with his friend Colin to England, and he met Delacroix there, and they became very good friends. And this is a drawing by Constable and a drawing by Delacroix. They actually drew together, and they were both very interested in history, so they were collecting drawings of historic costumes and also armor. But they got on very well. They both studied Constable's work. They may have met Constable, we're not 100% sure. There was an unfortunate meeting between Delacroix and Turner. Delacroix didn't like Turner. But Delacroix had an immediate impact on Bonington. This is Bonington. At the time that Delacroix was actually painting Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi. So it would have been right at the time of Byron's influence on Delacroix, on the other Romantic painters. This is the costume of a Greek, so it's referring to the Greek independence struggle. But it shows what a gifted painter Bonington is and how quickly he can absorb other painters' styles. And the lightness of his touch. but he still was doing landscapes like this. This landscape to me is kind of a synthesis of both Turner and Constable. But this is Delacroix, and there's a reason for showing it now. Delacroix was, like most of the Romantics, a great lover of Venice, and he was encouraging Bonington to visit Venice. And this painting is a celebration of the independence of a republic. What the man who has been beheaded here was the Doge, and he attempted to take absolute power. So the Venetians took it upon themselves to execute him in public. I can think of someone right now who I'd like to see that happen to. No more about that. But it's a very powerful painting, and it wasn't that well received in Paris at the time because Paris had gone back to being a monarchy. So Bonington, with a friend, takes a trip to Italy and finally arrives in Venice, where he spends a month sketching and painting like crazy. This is actually based on sketches he did on site. This was done later in Paris. But it's a lovely evocation of Piazza San Marco.
Wow.
This is the lagoon, and here you can see it's actually a water. I believe it's a watercolor. It's hard to tell with his work because he would mix gouache with watercolor and also use Arabic. So a lot of his watercolors look like oil. But this is a sketch done on site, obviously, and it makes, to me, it shows his link to Constable actually. Wonderfully restrained palette. This he would have done back in Paris. And it's interesting to me for a number of reasons. One is, you know, it echoes both Canaletto and Turner. But this is Venice after the last Doge has been forced to abdicate by Napoleon. And after the defeat of Napoleon, it becomes the spoils of Austria. So the Austrians are now controlling it. And the poor city has a very dilapidated look to me. Beautiful, but run down. This was actually a procession, Corso San Astasia Verona. But to me, it's a wonderful, wonderful evocation of Italian light and also religious festivals in the streets. I used to see things not that different from this when I first lived in Italy.
It's almost photographic.
Almost, yeah. Well, he's basing this on little sketches he did on site. This is an oil, but wonderfully,
It's so real, yeah.
Yeah.
wonderfully fresh too.
Yeah.
You don't get the feeling he ever overpays. Now this is a painting on the Amalfi Coast, a view of a town called Lerici, and I've always loved this painting, but it was only doing the research for this that I realized the significance of this painting. Notice the darkness down here and the funereal cypress, right? Well, a few years, let's see, this was painted 1827. So 5 years before this, the poet Shelley was drowned out here on his way back to Letter. in a storm.
Mm.
And he was burned on the beach. He was cremated on the beach, somewhere around Lerici.
Mm.
Now, this would have been a significant fact that Bonington would absolutely have known. Shelley, absolute genius. I don't know if you realize this, but his work influenced his writings, his philosophical writings influenced Karl Marx,
Mm.
Gandhi,
Mm.
Martin Luther King. He was a very deep thinker, very independent, as were all the, the who were flaunting all of the cultural norms. Yeah. But anyway, this painting obviously refers to that terrible tragedy.
I was gonna say, most of the paintings are shown with the landscapes. You definitely see the darkness and the lightness with like the structures in the back.
Yeah.
Is that something that they paint and then they put something over it, or they're adding to the painting where it lightens up like a mist?
How are you? Excuse me. What are you saying?
So like the front is very dark and rich, the background very light.
Yeah.
Is that something where they're adding a coat over something they painted, or they're just
No.
they're painting into that?
They're painting. That's the atmosphere. It's very common, that atmosphere in Italy.
Yeah.
It's the reason that Leonardo had his sfumato in his paintings. It's a very strong atmospheric perspective, partly because he is surrounded by fairly warm sea. And there's also a lot of burning
Right.
crops.
Okay. That's a good point. Yeah, just see a lot of really good perspective. So.
Yeah. Now, so Bonington by this time was ill.
Mm.
Guess what? Tuberculosis. It's a theme that runs through this whole talk about the Romantics, actually. But he still had about a year left, and he was painting, and it wasn't clear at this point he was fatally ill. But he continues, he pursues his history paintings. This is a very interesting one. It's let me see if I can find the. Oh yeah, okay. It's Francois I and Marguerite Navarre. Francis I was the king who took Leonardo back to France and the Mona Lisa. But before that, he was imprisoned for a while, captive in Spain. And his sister, Marguerite Navarre, actually made a very valiant attempt to free him. She didn't succeed, but he was finally released. But they were very, very close. And she herself was a really interesting figure. But you notice the interesting thing about Bonington's history paintings, he doesn't pick the dramatic moments like Delacroix. He picks the domestic moments. Like this one, which is a historic moment again. This is San Juan of Austria, the illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles. On his way to wars in the Netherlands, he disguises himself as just an ordinary person and gains audience to King Henry of France. This particular king was known to be a lazy fop, and Don Juan is actually shocked to see the king kind of just fanning himself and playing with his parrots. But it's a beautiful painting. Now, Bonington was back in England towards the end of his life now, and he exhibited this at the Academy in London, but the English didn't buy it. They weren't interested. They were totally into their landscapes. And this kind of historical painting meant nothing to them. But it's a really beautiful painting with an incredible use of color. By now, he was quite ill. His parents had joined him. They'd taken him to a doctor in London. And this is his next to last painting. and you wonder about it a little, the sunset, you know. But you see, in this painting, he's absorbed Turner to a rather large degree. He was incredibly gifted. His last painting, An Embarkation at Dusk, which makes you wonder if he's making a comment on his own dwindling power. So he dies at, I believe, at 28. He was a year younger than Shelley when he died. But he had a profound influence on his contemporaries and on the succeeding generation. And he's as I said before, he's a very interesting link between England and France, because Bonington and Constable and Turner together would influence the direction of French painting.
Anthony, is this a watercolor?
Yeah, this is a watercolor, but he's using gouache and he's probably using gum arabic.
Uh-huh.
Like, I think there's definitely overpainting in some places, but this is the paper showing through here.
Mhm.
But anyway, any comments?